This episode is proudly supported by Pepe Sayer Australian Cultured Butter.
It's a one-stop shop for all your butter needs at Pepe Sayer. So if you're a restaurant or an airline or a function centre or a cafe, you can give us a call or jump online with us, and we have everything you need for your butter needs. We cover all of it. The biggest one for me is the little logs that we make that you can cut down and put a little Pepe Sayer tab on it. Also the 15-gram portions, but we also do blocks. And in the blocks, so we do 25 kilo or 20 kilo, but we also do a 2 kilo. So you can buy a block of butter 2 kilo, and the prices are really competitive with the rest of the markets on those products.
For more information, go to pepesayer.com.au.
Wild game consumption and increasing the value of the wild game protein is going to have a massive impact. I mean, if we can just concentrate on growing our domestic consumption and putting a higher value on this protein, that will have a massive we've got a long way to helping control populations.
Welcome to a very special week of Dirty Linen. If you heard yesterday's podcast, you will know that I am handing over the microphone to chef and author Jo Barrett. We're celebrating the launch of Jo's book, Sustain, groundbreaking recipes and skills that could save the planet. And I thought rather than me just chatting to Jo about all the interesting things that are on her mind, that it would be great to get her to bring in some special guests to talk about different aspects of sustainability and how together we can make the world a better place. So Jo, I am going to handball the podcast to you. Welcome to Dirty Linen, and take Dirty Linen away.
Thanks, Dani. I feel like I've got some very big shoes to fill, and I'm really excited to have Billy Staughton on the phone from Discovered Wildfoods. As the name suggests, Australian wild game, venison, wild boar and goat, straight from the wild, free range, organic, nutrient dense, and in most cases a pest. Billy and his business partner, Tara Medina, set up Discovered Wildfoods as a delicious and sustainable solution to invasive species in Australia. And I'm really pumped to speak with Billy. I've known Billy since Future Food System, and we spent a bit of time together. However, just recently, myself and my partner have started to procure our own wild food. And after spending a bit of time in America, where it's a completely different culture around wild foods, I'm really keen to get Billy's insight into the industry and the potential for positive change for our environment in Australia. So welcome, Billy.
Hi, Jo. Thanks. Great introduction. Very succinct. Couldn't have said it better myself. Brilliant.
I hope I got it right. And I just want to say a massive congratulations to you and Tara. Discovered Wildfoods recently made it onto the 2023 Sustainability Leaders List for the Financial Review. And I want to say a massive congratulations.
Yeah, look, appreciate it. It's brilliant. It's good recognition, actually, especially from such an esteemed publication. But it's nice to actually for people to sort of get an understanding and a bit of insight into how sustainable it really is.
Could you give us a bit of insight into what Discovered Wildfoods is for the people who don't know?
So Discovered Wildfoods, it's essentially, practically it's a wild game harvest network that we have and a series of processing plants. And we're able to actually go and harvest wild animals within Australia that not all, obviously, any wild animals that have certain, categories or certain, type of, depending on their classification. So obviously not all deer, for instance, and certainly a lot of native species can't be harvested. But we're able to actually go and take animals from the environment, potentially that having negative impact, and process them and produce them as a food source.
Would you classified as a butcher, or a butchery?
Yeah, part of the business, it's kind of it's multifaceted. Because we're actually in the field, so we have harvesters deliberately in the field. We have processing, so we're meat processing, so we've got to skin them, which is a separate registration. Then we actually have a butchery is sort of the third step, and then there's logistics, and depending on they're going into retailers from there, or we're doing direct to consumer. So part of it certainly is butchery.
Yeah. Wow. And how did you get into it? I feel like Like, are you a hunter? And was it something that you started doing growing up, or did you just see a gap in the market? Or
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Sorry. So I grew up in the country. I grew up in the Upper Murray, so very top of the Murray River, and was hunting sort of all the time as a kid, and never really hunting deer or pigs or anything. They sort of weren't really around. And then it was later on, sort of getting into my 20s, that there just suddenly was this massive influx of deer. And at the same time, I'd spent a bit of time in the Northern Territory for a couple of years, and I'd been involved in some game management programs. Is probably a general term, but we would go out and even in helicopters and actually manage populations of pigs and even donkeys and all sorts of animals. And it's a funny sort of juxtaposition being involved in farming, in agriculture, where you're trying to produce protein and at the same time going out and managing other protein sources just because they're not favourable. You know, there's no current market for them. But as you said in the intro, they're nutrient dense, and potentially in a lot of cases they do a lot better than the animals that we're actually trying to cultivate. So cattle, sheep, the primary agricultural sources, they do well in some Australian climate and some areas, but for a lot of the rangeland, the wild deer and pigs, they just do exceptionally well. So I was involved in sort of seeing this, where you'd be struggling to rear cattle, especially up in the north, and you'd see these fat pigs just multiplying every time there's a rain. They'd be everywhere and would be drenching cattle, mustering cattle, and there'd be massive attrition rates, and you'd be dealing with climatic issues, and all these wild animals are just doing extremely well. And it was the sort of same when I was at home, where, you'd even in the middle of a drought, you'd find these wild animals, this game species, in particular deer, that just do so well in our bushlands. And there was a trigger point in 2018. The Victorian government allowed the commercialisation of wild deer. So they weren't directly classified as a pest, but then suddenly you were allowed to use them for commercial purposes, whereas before you'd only be able to use them for pet meats and non-commercial, so for private use.
do you think that's because the problem just became so big?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was a response to the problem. So they'd been classified, and they were introduced initially as a game species, sort of by gentleman hunters in the 1800s, and they'd been managed and cultivated for decades around being a viable source of game to hunt, which we can completely understand it. Even as a kid growing up, it was so exciting to see deer coming into the environment, and we'd walk around the bush, and any sign of them, you'd see rubs on trees, or you'd see some tracks, and it'd be exhilarating. So I completely understand where everyone was coming from. But then, on the other side of it, suddenly now those deer signs are they're everywhere. They're prevalent. You're seeing highways of tracks cutting through the sides of hills and wallows, and in delicate wetlands, and trees are getting ring barked because there's just so many deer rubbing on them.
I guess native flora and fauna for other critters and everything.
Yeah. Well, they do outcompete. I mean, it's the same thing. We obviously Australian native animals also do really well. So doing is actually it's a term relating to food consumption versus sort of output, how much protein or fat you can put on. So you X amount of kilos of a food type goes and gives you X amount of weight gain. So deer actually, if you put cattle or sheep out into our national parks, for instance, they wouldn't do. They'd go backwards. They'd lose condition and be sort of impalatable. But you look at in our bushlands, you see really healthy kangaroos and wallabies, and then you see these deer and pigs, and they do exceptionally well. So it was part of that idea that if you've got to manage these populations, because they're going to be encroaching on farmland, and so long as there is farming in Australia, there's going to be management of these external species of game or wild animals. So how is it that we can't utilize that? How is it that we can't take that and maybe make it a viable and valued protein in its own right?
And then so when the legislation changed, is that when you kind of thought, I've seen the damage, this is an opportunity?
Yeah, it was. I was actually at a hunting conference in Myrtleford it was a deer hunting expo, and there was would have been Victorian Parks, or it might have been Delp, had a stall with information on deer, and the guy said that they literally just legalized it, just legislated for the commercialization. So it sort of got my mind racing, and it's something I'd thought of. You look at the big picture, and it always made sense that there are international markets for goat, and international markets for deer, and international markets for boar, and Australia had met those markets with varying levels of success. But just sort of looking at it, it was this, what is a problem? Just saw it, an amazing opportunity. So was talking about it with my current business partner and a very good friend of mine, Tara Medina, and she's a very clever and ambitious young girl. So we were sort of sitting and talking about it, and just realised that, if it's such a good idea, and if the opportunity is right there, then it was remiss of us not to take it if we could see it right there. And what the upside obviously is massive positive impact on the environment, but it's also potentially a huge viable resource that we, it's just a matter of coming up with a method and getting some backing and working in with the right people to make it all happen.
Yeah, which I think probably is the biggest question for me, because I feel like there is such a potential there. And then if you look around, why isn't everybody kind of jumping on that opportunity? And I guess it probably wasn't easy setting up Discovered, because it's not like you can kind of herd deer and then pop them through an abattoir. So could you run through the process, I guess, of how you attain the proteins, and then what is your kind of chain to get it to a consumer? Yep.
So you're right. The opportunity is definitely huge, and I mean, Australia is huge, and our wild animal populations are huge, and international markets are huge. So it's all there. But to actually get it to the markets, you've got roaming populations of wild animals that although they may have sort of a ranging homeland, those population densities are constantly changing, and they're moving, and there's seasonality. And then you've got individuals with skill, and you've got a whole series of harvesters, as accredited harvesters. And so that to get the accreditation, there's a whole series of TAFE courses and skill sets that have to be achieved, and then you've got to get your registrations. And they've got to be constantly maintained, and then you've got to get access to the properties, because currently it can only be harvested on private properties. There's no access to national parks. Although the animals come from the national parks, often they'll be coming from the bush into sort of that fringe country or onto ag properties. And then you've got the seasonality. So cold, mainly the best harvesting periods are during the colder months, when you're dealing with rain and snow and ice and fog and frost. And then you've got, humans that are still going to be out there in those conditions night after night, dealing with their own, personal stuff. They've got things and potentially day jobs and bits and pieces. And that's only just getting the animal from the field. And then you've still got to get into a cool room. So they harvest the animal. There's, a certain amount of skills and accuracy training you've got to do, but you've got to be able to shoot the animal in the head. So it has to be a single shot to the brain. And then you've got to be able to get in and bleed the animal within 20 minutes. So you've got to get access to it. It has to be in a spot that's retrievable. And then you've got to get bled and then eviscerated, which is where you take out, sort of all the way from the throat down to the anus. You take it out as all one encapsulated body. So there's actually no spillage from any of the internal, from the internals, from the guts. And then you've got to be able to get that animal onto your ute, so onto your rack, which is generally a stainless steel accredited harvesting rack. And then you've got to get it from there back into a chiller, so a registered site with before sun comes up. And then it's got to go into your chiller and get a deep muscle probe and a data logger, and it has to get down to below sort of 7 degrees within the first 24 hours and held there. And from there, it gets either that is the processing plant, or generally that'll be a field chiller. And then from the field, it's got to get transported to our processing plant, where it is hung and kept at temperature, generally below 4 degrees, for a number of days. So we like to hang it up to 7 days with the skin on, just to get that consistency of texture and tenderness. And then it gets scun. And then once it's scun, you've still got to break it down, butcher it, and process it into its various cuts and pack it. And then, pack and label and restore and then send to either distributors or direct to consumer or people like yourself, into the food service industry, which is where we're really trying to aim. And then they sort of require it in a time frame and have orders backed up. But, you're always at the mercy of the seasonality and conditions and logistics and chillers breaking down. And so it's, the opportunity is huge, but the practicality of actually getting animals from the bush through a HC chain to, in a really high quality HC chain and a humane HC chain to the plate, there's a lot of steps and a lot of moving parts, which makes it exciting, but doesn't make it easy.
I can, just finding the deer at the start, going through that whole process is incredible. And, you end up with a product that there's no hormones, there's no antibiotics, free range, it's doing what it was doing. Can you tell a difference, from farming and agriculture to now wild foods? Have you noticed a big difference within the protein and even just the climate of are people receiving wild foods in a positive way?
I think it's like with anything, there are, whether or not it's subtle or not, the protein obviously as a wild, part of it is the handling and the condition of the animal to a degree, but generally it's a leaner meat, but it has this amazing sort of nutrient density that once you start to eat it, you do notice that feeling, that sort of energizing vitality that it gives you. It doesn't give you that sort of burden. You don't have a feeling of being sort of weighted down, regardless of the quantity you eat. I mean, I had some venison samba T-bones for lunch. I just popped into the butcher shop in Beechworth here and I grabbed some. They're absolutely brilliant. But I genuinely and always have felt you can notice the difference in terms of how the actual meat makes you feel. Then obviously the more you look into it and the more you get an understanding of, if you can consciously get an understanding that what you're eating also has a benefit, I think that also plays a part. If you know that, if you can, I've sort of always looked at hunger as, as like the last untapped renewable energy source. We sort of humans, there's a lot of us, 7 billion and growing. And we have this hunger that just, even if you eat 3 hours later, you're hungry again. And it's just this never-ending energy source. And if we can direct that and sort of try and control it towards positive outcomes, I think that's going to have a huge impact on how we move forward and how we progress and have, improve the sustainability of our conditions. So I think if we can, that's sort of all part of the mission. If we know that the product, the quality of the product and the nutrient density and how it actually reacts in your own body is good and it's a positive. And if we know that removing these animals from the environment within Australia is really positive and has a massive net benefit to the environment, and you combine those two factors, it definitely makes eating more of this meat seem really like the right thing to do and gives you a good feeling as you're eating it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I guess there's the subject of kind of population management and the culling programs that happen in Australia, which, it's easy to say it doesn't make sense because they are a protein that we could be eating. Do you ever see there being a point in the future where those culling programs could kind of be curbed maybe more towards protein attainment, or maybe wild foods could become more prevalent in our supermarkets rather than either the poisoning of them and them dying in parks, or just the shooting and being left to die?
Yeah, there's the culling. I mean, I guess wild game management it's always a system, and I think that, multifaceted. There are control methods that need to be implemented. And I don't think this is the silver bullet. I think game harvesting is part of a system. I don't think it is the one answer. I think the culling programs that exist generally focus on high sensitive environments. So, mountaintops. There was a good harvesting they were doing some aerial culling recently up in the Upper Murray Oil from Pine Mountain, which is actually the largest monolith in Australia, and it's a really sensitive area. You can't really get in there and harvest, and even if you could, it's a national park, so you can't actually withdraw the meat. So I think that culling plays a part for sure, but baiting programs I think have been proven to be disastrous in New Zealand. Also, given that deer are herbivores, it's difficult to prevent other animals from eating the same baits. There's a whole, and then the animals die and generally have toxins in them, and then who's going to be, which natives are eating the animals. There's a whole, and I also think we've got a responsibility for humane destruction, which is part of the training that you get to become a harvester. Humane destruction of the animal is imperative. It's absolutely integral. So a single shot to the brain is essentially, especially when the animal's in its native environment and it's living its best life. The only way to actually shoot an animal in the head is if it's not moving. And generally, as soon as they know you're there and they're under any stress, they'll move. So to be able to destroy or kill an animal without it moving, without it being under stress, is the most humane method possible in my opinion. So from a culling doesn't necessarily achieve that. Generally, they are on the run. You shouldn't hit from a helicopter, and you have to put multiple bullets into them. So but as I said, I think it's part of a control method that will always be around, and I think it's valuable for those high sensitive environmental areas where you can't. We have harvesters that do a lot of culling as well, and they're generally from the ground. They'll be going in camping for a week at a time in national parks and taking out resident populations that hunters can't get to. People aren't going to go to the effort to get to these things, but they still cause a lot of damage in these particular areas. So, yeah, I think everything has a part to play, but I definitely think that wild game consumption and increasing the value of the wild game protein is going to have a massive impact. I mean, I think if we can just concentrate on growing our domestic consumption and putting a higher value on this protein, that will have a massive. They've got a long way to helping control populations, and prevent this rapid population growth at the very least. I don't think it'll ever get rid of animals altogether. I think they're here to stay, but that means we need ongoing control methods. And to have an ongoing culling method, in the 1920 financial year, there was $25 million put together from the Victorian budget into wild game management, and that's meant for wild dogs and deer and pigs, but they put, I believe, the vast majority of that into deer management, which was predominantly aerial culling. So let's say $20 million to control deer, and the numbers you'd be able to get it, but we're talking thousands of deer. We're not talking hundreds of thousands of deer, not talking tens of thousands. They shot thousands of deer. Through our system and through our network of harvesters, we're able to get 30, 40, 50,000 deer a year, and grow, and we could grow that significantly if we could continue to grow the market.
It's incredible. Like, just recently I went to America for a bow hunting, not a hunting trip, but like a bow obstacle course. And we did a bit of cooking in Aspen for the Aspen Food and Wine Show. And I'd never really been to America for something that was related to hobbies like that. And I kind of had this expectation that, everyone would be eating deer because hunting over there is a bit more accepted than here. And I know that has to do with firearm regulations over there and the difference here. But, it's a multi-million-dollar industry in America and not here. But I cooked venison thinking that it was going to be, everyone would be eating venison. And it was very well received, but it wasn't local venison, and it came from New Zealand. And it was a farmed venison, which I had no idea about. And then I kind of started to look into it and saw that majority of venison eaten outside of Australia and the rest of the world is coming from New Zealand. And I know in America they've got the Maui Nui venison, which is they're doing culling on one of the islands in Hawaii. Do you think, with what's happening in Australia, it could ever go to an export level, considering it's such an issue here?
Certainly. Our midterm goal is to get export. Path to export is difficult. It's a different tier of processing plant. You need an EQUIS approved vet, and your controls are a lot higher. So it's an enormous expense. But that, I think, New Zealand's a great example because in, say, the 80s, Australia and New Zealand were on parity regarding game consumption and venison consumption. And the New Zealand government actually boarded together with agricultural groups and individuals to create a sort of a game body, and they actively marketed the consumption of game. And a lot of that was in response to their wild populations. And they had an enormous wild deer population that was actually a massive problem. And they at the same time started a domestic venison herd, and subsequently they, with that sort of concerted effort from government and private sectors, they've managed to get fully on top of their wild deer population to the point that now it's sort of reserved for hunting. They don't necessarily have a lot of wild game harvesting anymore, and their national herd's at about 1 million deer. And is by far the largest deer producer in the world, whereas Australia, our national herd is about 40,000 currently, but our wild herd is probably about, depending who you look at, minimum 2 million. Sort of the higher grade would be 4 million. So it's sort of the complete reverse, and that's come from a lack of coordination, a lack of a coordinated sort of response. The domestic consumption of venison in New Zealand's about 20 times what Australia's is. So I think that's, as a study, New Zealand's a great example. If we can, they actually have, they reversed their deer populations. And I think America, their appetite for wild is huge and growing, and they do have a really strong a really strong hunting culture. Commercial harvesting of deer is illegal because they're a native species, so their Parks and Wildlife Act don't allow it. And I don't know if it necessarily will, whereas the access deer on Maui Nui, so on the actual Maui Nui venison, they're an access deer, they're an imported deer, which is why it's allowed. So I think the opportunity into America is enormous. Getting it there there's a hurdle around cash, but there's no necessary hurdle around that supply network. But then, in tandem with that and working with that is developing this domestic demand, which is where people like yourself come in, Jo, and great podcasts like this where you can spread the word and get the awareness out of exactly what, how big the opportunity is, how good and the quality of the protein, and that the more we eat, the better it is, across the board.
It's been an interesting time because, probably a couple of years ago, the most I'd done with venison is pretty much what everyone else had done, probably just seared a loin. And then I started getting into the idea of, procuring your own food, and, with Mark LeBroy, and and to be honest, I thought hunting was really bogan and it was just guys walking around with guns. And then I went to Broadside and went on a deer hunt, and my whole kind of view was flipped, where actually a lot of these guys and girls are looking for a sustainable protein. And, since then I've started to really cook a lot more with venison, and we do at the restaurant. And it's delicious. And I probably get more excited about the fact that it is, that it can be a solution to a problem. And started to doing more like braising, like slow cooking. And, you often kind of tie up lean meats being dry, but, cooking the shanks and the heels, and they're full of, gelatinous deliciousness, and beautiful stocks and broths and sauces that you can get from the bones. So it's been really exciting, and I guess we're running out of time, but what is your favourite cut on the deer, and how do you like to cook it?
I definitely like I really like those gelatinous slow cooked bone cuts, like shanks and even some of the shoulder and the neck rosettes in a stew. But I live on very, very rare, and we're talking even cold blue loin and primal cuts. It's it's my daily routine. It's just a vast amount of protein intake. But it is, there's definitely a trick to it. There's a trick to it. It's just a slightly different way of handling it, isn't it? You can't just take it and apply the same techniques you would with beef or lamb. It doesn't sort of it's not as forgiving, but at the same time, once you get an understanding, it's no more difficult.
I think what I'm learning. Here's a tip for all my chef friends out there who are thinking to put venison on their menus: not simmering it too hard. So I've been putting it in the oven about 85 degrees, and you leave it in there overnight, and you can get really similar results that you can get from cooking, slow cooking lamb or beef, but the flavor is so different. It's a lot lighter. So you can kind of marry up vegetables and herbs a lot easier, and you feel a bit lighter after eating it. So I think if anyone's kind of thinking about trying venison in the restaurant, do it. I think, and we've had it received really well by people coming in to dine. They haven't really blinked an eye, especially when the only red meat option has been venison. It hasn't turned anyone off. Billy, I think what you and Tara do is incredible. And it's exciting for Australia and the whole industry, and such a great solution. And I've got a pie recipe in the cookbook for people who want to try cooking venison, and as well wallaby. That's another animal that has culling programs involved. So just want to say thank you for coming on the podcast, and thanks for what you do.
Absolute pleasure, and thoroughly enjoy what we're doing as well. So thanks for having me.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This